Hello everyone, this is Matthew Jana for Card Runners, and I'm here with Out of Position 3-Bet Pot Play, Part 1. So let's first briefly discuss the goals for the series. We want to brush up on the theory for 3-Bet Pot Play. This information will be presented throughout the video as necessary. So I'm not going to stay away from theory or anything like that in this video, but I'm also not going to just have a long theory lecture video thing going on here. We're going to get comfortable playing 3-bet pots when out of position through randomly generating flops, so we're going to be doing a lot of that. These spots are rarely discussed for a few reasons. Number one is they're just difficult. Being out of position is hard, yet 3-bet pots, people are pretty uncomfortable with the ranges in addition to that, so people don't usually talk about it much. They're also uncommon at lower stakes. Most people don't 3-bet enough and fold too frequently to 3-bets as well. So between people just not 3-betting all that often, and then people adjust by folding like crazy to 3-bets, 3-bet pots don't really come up as often as they probably should. So low-stake players especially are not too familiar with the ranges. And it's hard to just jump in without already understanding concepts pretty well. So this isn't like a good starting off series. You have to already understand, in position versus out of position play, how ranges change, how equity does not imply expected value. You need to have a good sense of those things before you're really going to be able to make things click for 3-bet pots. Nevertheless, these spots are quite important since a significant amount of money is at stake, since the pot's big, and they occur frequently between good, aggressive, or close to optimal players. So that's one thing that's kind of consistently surprised me as I did more pre-flop math, is just how often you're going to have someone open in the button, get 3-bet from the blinds, and then have the button call. That just is going to occur absolutely nonstop, much more than people probably think it should before having played with the math. Even at, medium stakes, it probably should occur more often than it does. So these are important spots to learn. They're just not going to be that easy, but a lot is at stake here. This series assumes you understand basic theory. I'm a big advocate of pick the low-hanging fruit first. In other words, fix the easiest and most important leaks first. So if you're someone that doesn't play professionally or is playing really low stakes right now and just starting to understand a bunch of new concepts in poker, you probably want to focus on easier leaks to fix rather than the less important, more difficult ones, so this series might not be for you. Playing out of position is just difficult, even when stacks are smaller relative to the size of the pot, like they are in 3-bet pots. If you're a newer player, you probably want to stick with easier strategies at first. So the reason why people recommend bet folding so much to newer players is just because it's a very easy strategy to implement. A more optimal strategy involves check calling a lot when you're out of position, check raising a lot when you're out of position, depending on the board texture. And those strategies are usually just much more difficult to implement than just kind of betting a lot and then once you check folding mostly. So be aware we're going to be recommending a lot of the more difficult strategies here. As such, this isn't a topic I recommend beginners address until they feel reasonably confident with other aspects of their game. So I already said that. Now it's time to go over the parameters of this video. So throughout the video, we'll be assuming the following. Bets will be approximately 0.5 pot size bets, so we'll need to defend at least 2/3 if we wish to prevent the opponent from being able to profitably bet any two cards. So we have to defend 2/3 of the time to make our opponent unable to profitably bet with any two cards once we check to him. We're also going to assume our opponent is really, really good. He's better than us. We'll talk about some exploitative stuff, but 3-betting and 3-bet calling frequencies change pretty significantly based on the stakes. So we want to focus on playing well versus everyone, especially players who are better than us. So again, if you're playing at really low stakes where people just don't 3-bet bluff middle position when they're out of position from one of the blinds, then you're going to want to take that into account. But here we're always going to assume the opponent is better than us, so he's going to be 3-betting very, very aggressively, especially when we're opening from the button and he's in the blinds. We're also going to assume we're human, so there's no robots watching this video. In other words, we just want to get good enough to give ourselves a bigger edge. We're not going to be anal about getting everything to balance perfectly. Additionally, if two lines look close with the same hand, rather than waste time trying to solve an insolvable situation, we'll opt to just take the easier line. So it's something that's a little bit important to mention right now. A lot of times what happens in theory is you should take two different lines with the same hand, and both those lines should have the same EV. This happens all the time. It's going to happen especially often in 3-bet pots because we might find out like we have 16 combinations of ace-queen, 16 combinations of ace-king. These hands make up a huge chunk of our range. We'll talk about how you can do take two different lines with the same hand, but we're not going to get really anal about worrying exactly how many hands go into each range because it's just not something we're going to be able to solve. And at the end of the day, we're going to want to emphasize taking the easier line because that's probably going to ultimately win us more money because we'll make less mistakes. So the ranges for today will be small blind 3-bet versus button open. And of course, we're going to assume the button calls because we're going to be talking about the flop. So this is one of the most common spots you'll find yourself out of position in a 3-bet pot when the button opens and you 3-bet them in the small blind because it folds to the button all the time and the small blind needs to 3-bet very aggressively. That's especially true if you're playing at games where people are like min-raising the button. You need to be 3-betting them really frequently. This will shed light on the 3-betting ranges. Maybe the small blind 3-betting range or button flatting range is a bit off. It's hard to tell before analyzing post-flop in detail. So when I made pre-flop ranges, of course, I'm figuring out, okay, how much money does the button risk to win the blinds, and then how often are the blinds calling, and then they need a 3-bet at this frequency. That's the most important stuff for figuring out the ranges. But for a lot of the fine-tuning stuff, it's just going to come from after you spent a lot of time playing post-flop, or after you spent a lot of time randomly generating flops and analyzing different situations, you probably will start tweaking the ranges because you'll realize, hey, there's a few hands that aren't in the range that probably should be, and a few hands that are in the range that maybe shouldn't be. So we'll probably find a little bit of that there, and maybe we'll want to change our pre-flop ranges. Let's rock. So let's go over the ranges really quickly. Here is the small blind 3-betting range that I'm going to use. It's 17.5%, which is probably more aggressive 3-betting ranges than most people are used to. But you're going to have to 3-bet the button really aggressively to prevent him from opening super, super wide. And as you'll see in just a minute, if the button's opening even reasonably wide, like 45% or so, he has to defend really wide against a 3-bet. So here's the range I chose. I don't want to cold call very much in the small blind, so we have pretty good 3-bet bluff randomizers, like a lot of ace-x and king-x suited, which is nice. A lot of suited connectors and suited gappers, and then even a few pocket pairs I didn't want to call with. The good hands here are pretty much 10s and better, king jack and better, and ace 10 and better. And I've talked about it in other videos, but especially for pre-flop play and flop play, the terms value bet and bluff really don't work perfectly. You still use them. I used to use them more than I like to use them now. But what I don't want anyone to do is to think of king jack off as like a bluff or a value bet pre-flop. King jack off, it does decently well in a 3-bet pot if our opponent calls in the button, but also we hate getting 4-bet, and even king jack off is really happy when we 3-bet a pre-flop and we made our opponent fold a hand like 10-6 suited, because 10-6 suited will outdraw our king jack off all the time. So yeah, so don't really think about a lot of these hands up here, or even the hands around here as really necessarily bluffs or value 3-bets. They're just hands that play well in 3-bet pots that are also happy if we make our opponent fold a high equity hand in position pre-flop. Okay, so here's the button calling range. Notice I have him slow playing aces like a boss. So, yeah, here's the button calling range. Again, there's some things that can maybe be tweaked here a little bit. It's possible that ace-queen suited or so is a 4-bet or something like that. But for the most part, I think this looks pretty reasonable. You'll notice this range is a lot wider than probably most people are used to playing with. And a lot of the hands we're calling with here, we're not happy to call. Like, we don't really want to have to call with king 10 off or ace 4 suited. It's just, if we fold, the button's already lost their 2 big blind or 2.5 big blind open, and calling the 3-bet overall will lose less money than folding to it. So here is the button defending range, and again, if the button's defending much less than this, then it's going to let the blinds just 3-bet super aggressively and profitably pre-flop. All right, cool. So I've already plugged in the pre-flop ranges to PokerStove, and it looks like the 3-betting range has about 52% equity, and the button calling range has about 48% equity. So the button is in position and got a good price on the call pre-flop when he faced a 3-bet, but remember, the small blinds range has a much better distribution of equity. The small blinds range has much more premium hands, and then a lot of its, I'm going to say the word bluffs, a lot of its bluffs retain their equity very well. So just keep that in mind. This could mean that the small blind 3-betting range is a little bit too wide, or the button's not calling wide enough, but this is where we're going to start. Okay, so let's do it. Let's randomly generate one. All right, so that's a pretty reasonable one to start with. So now we're going to analyze this spot the same way I always analyze single raise pots. So if you're like me, you have way, way more experience with single raise pots than 3-bet pots. But yeah, it's going to be the same type of analysis. We just want to write down the flop, how many combos we have, then design our betting, check calling, check raising range, all that fun stuff. And then we'll just learn from there. So total combos, we have 211 on this board. And then now we need to figure out sort of what kind of hands we want to bet. What do we want to check call with? What do we want to check raise with? So since I'm new to this, and I imagine most people watching this are too, they haven't spent much time with these ranges actually writing everything down, I would just start with what seems like the easiest stuff. So for example, I would check call pocket queens because I'm removing almost all the queens from my opponent's range, and it's nice to check calls from really strong hands. I would also check raise pocket fives because I want to be able to defend my checking range by check raising sometimes, and pocket fives seem like they fit the bill pretty well for that. I also think, though I could be wrong, so I don't want to start writing it down yet, we can maybe check call with hands like pocket aces with an ace of diamonds, because that allows our opponent to like run some tainted flush draws and stuff like that, and our hand's not very vulnerable, but we might end up betting with that. So, just starting out with the easier stuff. So what kind of hands would I definitely value bet? I think I'm going to definitely value bet kings. I don't remove any of my opponent's queens, so we can have all of his ace-queen combos. I do block his king-queen, but he can have his queen-jack, and I think even queen-10 too. So I'm going to start with value betting kings. I'm also going to value bet ace-queen. That's 12 combos right now. King-queen looks close, but I'm going to go ahead and start with value betting it. We'll just fix it later if we need to. And that looks like a pretty good starting point, although it's not betting very aggressively. So we might want to add in some more combos. But we'll be adding in bluffs and draws in just a second. So that's going to be 30. Again, we might up this up quite a bit in a minute. All right, so let's see. The kind of draws, I don't want to list all the flush draws. I mean, who am I trying to impress? So when we take out the queens, that's going to be 19 flush draws total. So let's just say we're going to bet 12 of the flush draws. So flush draw 12. Hold on this for 1 second. So you can see in the upper left hand of the screen, it says flush draw 10.4%, 22 combos out of 211. Then we're taking out the king, queen of diamonds, the ace, queen of diamonds, and the queen, nine of diamonds. So that leaves us with 19. Then I'm only going to bet 12. Then let's just say we check call, flush draw 3, and then we'll say we check raise. Let's say 3 here, and then we'll bump this to 13. Sure. Nothing to worry too much about. All right, so then we have the value betting range, which will change as we learn more, and then the draw betting range. So bluffs, let's again start off with the easiest bluffs. So what kind of hands do we want to bluff with? So the hands that make the perfect bluffs are hands that retain their equity and make our opponent fold hands which beat us, and also hands which can dominate us if we get like a bad turn. So for example, if we bet, I'm going to pick like I think what might be the easiest example. Let's say we have king 4 of hearts. This hand seems pretty obviously like I'm going to want to c-bet this because I can make my opponent fold kings that can outdraw us on the turn, as well as just ace-high hands that beat us now. And king 4 has kind of like a jank 3 to a straight, 3 to a flush thing going. So a hand like king 4 of hearts seems good. I'm just going to go ahead and see that there's a king 8, king 7, king 6, king 5, king 4 of hearts. So I'm going to go with king x, heart 5. I think I'm going to go with the king jack of hearts 2. So that's 1. Oh, and one thing I didn't talk about. We're going to do theory as we go along. I would say for a 3-bet pot, we're going to want around 1.5 bluffs for every 1 value bet, give or take. So since there's less stack depth and we're out of position, we can't bluff nearly as aggressively as we could in other videos when we were like in position for a single raise pot. So because of that, we need to have fewer bluffs for every value bet, but that probably isn't going to be all that difficult to do since our 3-betting range had a lot of kick-ass hands in it. So just keep that in mind. So like right now, we want to find like 45 bluffs. So let's go ahead and try to do that. So same drill. Let's go like, I'm just going to put like this jank stuff. So I'm going to count it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So that's going to be, I'm just going to write like XX heart hands at 7 more. And then, so these hands we can bluff with or check raise with the 7, 5, 6, 5, 5, 4. So right now for check raising 3 hands, we're probably going to want around not all that many bluffs because of what I talked about before, how there's less stack depth, so we have to bluff less aggressively. So let's say we check raise, 5-4 suited, that gives us 3 right there. And then let's just say we're going to bet with the other 5s. So 6-5 suited is 3, 7-5 suited is 3. Okay, moving along. Other stuff we could bet with, I would even say, and this could be wrong, I don't know the answer, like 4x, 4 of diamonds, 4x, because that, you can see here if we put the pocket 4s here, or pocket 3s too. Let's do that too. we can still hit some runner stuff, and we maybe can make our opponent just like fold his like pocket sixes or pocket sevens on the flop, because he might not want to float that. Even though sixes and sevens have a lot of equity, they're not really going to outdraw us very often, and all of our bluffs have a ton of equity. So I think we could probably consider betting the fours and the threes with a diamond. That might be wrong. We can come back to it in a bit. And then, yeah, so then I'm going to pause this for a second and then add in some bluffs. So I added in some ace-x of hearts, some king-jack off with the diamonds, ace-2 and ace-5 suited, which I didn't notice earlier, that made pairs, and then ace-10 or ace-10 off with the ace of diamonds. And that got us to 44 combos, which is close to 45. Again, we might find we want to change this stuff and maybe take these hands out. I'm not really sure yet, but this gives us a good starting point. Another thing which I probably should have done earlier is I should have just plugged in the board texture here just to see how equity's changed on this board. So it went from having 48% equity to... Okay, so it didn't change at all, so it really didn't matter much. So this is a good thing to do, though, to see if your range really like whiffs on a specific flop, but it didn't look like our range did here. We still have around 51, 52% equity. Okay, so another thing I should have done earlier was probably start with some of the obvious check calling hands as well. Like, so I think jacks and tens might be close. I'm actually going to bet tens, I think. I'll talk about that in a minute. So check call jacks and queen nine suited. So one thing that kind of sucks about this specific range is, like, if the flop's ace or king high, which is obviously more common than a queen high flop, we have a bunch of hands that work really well as check calls. Here, we don't have as many, since I didn't 3-bet bluff with as many like suited queens, like queen 8, queen 7, queen 6 suited, which can then check call pretty well. So it's something to keep in mind here. Maybe I should try to fit in like queen 8 suited or queen 7 suited and move something else around, because we don't have as many hands that work well as check calls, especially since we bet the king queens. Though I still have pocket aces that I haven't put anywhere, so let's do this. Let's put aces 3 here, and then I'm going to put aces 3 down here. I'll even remember that they're the aces with the diamond here. So that gets us to some more check calls there. We might want to check raise the aces. No, we wouldn't. We'd probably check call them. Okay. So that's widening the check calling range a little bit. This range is obviously super, super strong right here. So we're going to mix in like check calling some ace diamonds. So like, let's put in like a few. We'll put in ace king 7 there, and I'll talk about that in just 1 second. Okay. And then I'm also, before I forget, going to add in the tens up here. Even though calling tens a value bet is using the term really loosely. But let's talk about a few things here. Why do I want to bet tens? Because betting tens, I think, can make the opponent fold ace-jack and king-jack. And tens are a lot more vulnerable to ace-jack and king-jack than pocket jacks are. Pocket jacks are quite happy if a jack turns against our opponent's ace-jack, even if that's only one out. And pocket jacks only have a 1 overcard when the opponent has king-jack or ace-jack, whereas tens have 6 overcards. So I think I would bet tens, because this will give us a hand that can check call on the turn after betting the flop, and because I want to make ace-jack and king-jack fold. Whenever I talk about spots like this, I do not know what the correct answer is. It's so unsolvable. I'm just explaining my reasoning for what I think is best and trying to get things to click. So that's my thoughts. If you disagree and you're working along with me, then go ahead and move tens to a check call, or you could even check call some and bet some. All that stuff's fine. I don't have the answer. So that gets us to 39 value bets, but a lot of the value bets are weaker, but we definitely can add in some more bluffs. Okay, so for check calling, I like the idea of check calling ace-king here, because the same way I just said, hey, if I bet pocket tens, I can make my opponent fold some ace-jack and king-jack. That's awesome when I'm betting tens. When I have ace-king, less awesome. Because now my opponent might fold his ace-jack. I'm assuming he won't fold ace-jack with like an ace of diamonds, but he might fold ace-jack of spades. And then ace-king wasn't really vulnerable to that hand. If the ace turns, he just hit a tainted ace, and then ace-king is going to win at showdown. So I'm check calling with some ace-king here, because I want to have some hands that can bluff later in a balanced range, and also because I want to keep my opponent's dominated hands involved. Again, do I know exactly whether or not ace-king is a bet or a check call, or which ones go where? Of course not. I'm just making my best guess that I know if we, like, a lot of people will check call with a range like this. I'm actually going to delete the flush draw too. A lot of people will check call with a range like that. In fact, a lot of people might even just still bet the queens and the aces, But it's not hard for our opponent to play against this range because all we do have is some super awesome hands and then some medium strength showdown hands. We want some hands like this that can be bluffed later when we decide to bet this stuff after our opponents check through. So check calling with some of those hands can be pretty useful, and it really makes the range click. So I'm again going to pause and try to just count everything up. Actually, no, I'm not going to pause yet. Let's add in a few more bluffs. So we want to add in some more bluffs here. So I think we can bet with some, like, I'm going to go ace-jack 7. So that just means the ace-jack with the runner flush. So that gets us to 51. And then I'm also going to go, let's see what else looks good here. We've already kind of gotten the random X stuff, so I think we're okay. Actually, I think we're doing pretty well right now. Oh, let's do ace-10 of hearts. I missed that earlier. Okay, so that adds this to 52. Again, this gets our bluffing frequency up a little bit, especially since we are betting some draws, which we haven't talked about too much. The draws aren't going to affect our ratio very much, so I shouldn't even say that. But we are betting some, some 10s and then some aces that we weren't betting before. So if we get this up to 52, that's going to make our total combos. 52 plus 13 is 65. 65 plus 39 is, I used to be so much faster at this, 104. Okay, so total combos bet is 104. Let's add in betting frequency. So that's going to be 104 divided by 211. And then I am going to pause and put that in. So all the time I'll say something incorrectly as I'm making these videos, and then I'll have to re-record after I've already made some changes into the document. So I'm doing that right now. So I said something incorrectly, so now I'm going back and I'm going to say it correctly this time. And what I was originally saying, though, is one thing you could obviously tell from the ranges I just had, were if I'm checking like 100 combos on the flop and I'm only defending like 30 of the checks, that means I'm check folding 70% of the time. And if I'm only check raising like 6% of the time, then my opponent's just going to have no incentive to really not see bet any 2 cards on the flop. So the previous ranges we had, sort of the first rough draft, those can't really be correct. It's kind of too much of a betting type range and not defending enough checks. That's a very common thing to do as you're first starting to like try to fix these problems. You found out you were betting too much, but now we're trying to fix it. So what I was doing is I was moving some of the king-queen hands to the check calling range because that's going to let us check call a little bit wider. But the easiest way to start defending more of your checks is actually to check raise. Because here, if we're sticking to a rough estimate of around 1 bluff to 1 value raise when we check raise, that's going to make it a lot easier on us to defend more combos because for every 1 value combo we also had 3 bluffs. And I think we also should have draws here, and I just forgot it earlier, right? 3 flush draws here, 3 flush draws here, and 3 flush draws up here. Perfect. So yeah, check raising is useful because it allows us to bluff more for every value hand we have. And because when we check raise, we're not guaranteed to see the turn. Sometimes our opponent's just going to fold, so that's nice too, since we don't always have to play the turn out of position. So what I was doing is I was deciding to check raise these kings with the diamond because I thought if it checks through, even though an ace kind of sucks, I mean, an ace definitely sucks, it doesn't kind of suck, but the thing that's nice about check raising kings is I don't block my opponent's ace-queen. So you can make an argument that aces might be a better check raise on the flop because they're not afraid of checking through and having the turn card come an ace. But the advantage, of course, of checking kings is our opponent has all of his ace-queens in his range, so then if we check, he bets and we check raise. That's awesome because he's going to stack off all those hands, whereas he might not stack off all of his king-queens. I'm not exactly sure. At the end of the day, I also just like the idea of checking with the diamond because then that makes it easier if our opponent checks back and the turn's a diamond for us to run a run or a flush when he hits a lower flush. As such, went ahead and check raised the kings, and then now I'll put in some more bluffs. So what bluffs do we have? And it's actually getting a little difficult to find the bluffs because these suited kings and suited aces that aren't, the hearts or the diamond are just really hard to utilize. Oh my gosh, I missed that we had gutshots this whole time. Okay, so that's going to change that a little bit. So we're also going to be bluffing with ace-4 suited and ace-3 suited, because those are gutshots, and gutshots are awesome. And that's going to let us check raise some other stuff, which would probably be, let's take the 6-5 suited and move it down here. So this probably seems pretty haphazard, and it is. And this is pretty much how I go about fixing and improving my game when I'm trying to work away from the tables. You're not going to remember this stuff very well if you are just given a document where a friend did it for you and goes, here's how I would approach this flop. That's still not bad to do this kind of stuff and trade with someone else who does it too, so you both have access to twice as many sort of analyzed hands. But you learn so much more doing it yourself and making mistakes. And even now, when I'm talking and trying to, think ahead and make stuff click, I totally missed that we had Gutshots here, which is actually going to make our life quite a bit easier because I was having trouble finding enough bluffs. So now I'm going to go ahead and refix everything. So pause real quick, refix everything, and then we can talk about it again. Okay, so I just cleaned everything up. Let me display it all at once. And I have that we are value betting 32 combos, betting 13 draws, bluffing 53 combos. So not quite the 1.5 to 1 ratio, but pretty close. So we have 98 combos bet. Our betting frequency is 46.4%. We're checking 113 combos, and we are defending 44 combos, so defending 40% of our checks. So if we want to prevent our opponent from being able to properly bet any two cards on this board, and we probably don't, which I'll talk about in a minute, but if we did, we would need to be defending around 67% of our checks to prevent him from making an immediate profit. In reality, queen-high boards hit the opponent pretty well, and once we've checked, we've already shown weakness, so we're probably not going to defend 70 or 67 or 70% of the time or anything like that. But I do still think this is too low, despite it probably being significantly higher than most people use in practice, because I'm guessing most people that are watching this video right now do not defend this aggressively, especially with regards to the check raising. So the next thing I want to look into, since I don't think we're defending aggressively enough, is I want to start playing around with certain hands against the opponent's overall range. How much equity does his overall range have? So for example, right now I have that we're folding ace-king. My guess is I'm learning right now that can't be right because ace-king probably is going to have a lot of equity and we're not defending enough hands right now. So let's try ace-king off. Evaluate. So ace-king has 54% equity. So we're going to have a really tough time in making the argument that ace-king is going to be a check fold because, first of all, ace-king just has a bunch of equity. Our opponent's going to be betting relatively small when we bet to him. And there was another reason. I just drew a blank. See, again, I'm talking while I'm trying to set myself up while trying to fix stuff. Something else which hopefully I'll remember in a minute. So ace-king, I'm going to go ahead and change this to 15 combos. Again, not wanting to double count the flush draw. So when I do that, I went from 7 to 15, so that I added 8. So that gets us up to 37. Again, the reason why I'm check calling ace-king is I want to keep my opponent's dominated hands involved, and I need to have some check calling range myself. The other thing I'm starting to notice with this range is, since I am having difficulties check calling here, it would be nice if I somehow can sneak in some more like suited queens, and maybe I can take off something else. So in practice, I'd say kings are going to be better than queens, so you might not want to do this, but maybe in theory, it should be like buy king 4 suited, hello, queen 8 suited, buy king 5 suited, hello, queen 7 suited, because that will give us more hands that connect on this board, and we might not need to connect as high on the king-high boards. So anyways, after doing this, this gets us to 52 combos, which will actually help our check calling range significantly. And the other thing I want to keep in mind is when you're check calling ace-king, it sounds like it's so gross and terrible to check call an ace-king, but at the end of the day, if ace-king makes up such a huge fraction of our check calling range, we're going to have to take different lines with the hand on later streets. Sometimes we're just going to check our ace-king down and hope to win that showdown, even though our opponent might beat us sometimes with a really weak pair. Other times we might choose to bluff with ace-king. But if we bluff with all of our ace-king, we'll probably be bluffing too much. So just keep in mind what I was talking about earlier, which is especially in 3-bet pots, ace-king might make up such a large chunk of our range that we can't always take the same line with it, especially if we check call the majority of them on the flop. Okay, so let me go ahead and recalculate that. Okay, so now we're betting 46% of the time and defending 46% of our checks. So we're getting close to betting half of our hands and defending half of our checks, which is a lot better than where we started. So at this point, I'm having a hard time figuring out more hands that we can defend aggressively. And I want to just remind everyone of sort of like the restrictions we have here. First of all, if we're betting 98 hand combos, and if we're defending 52 checks, then that's 98 plus 52, 150. So out of 150 out of 211 hands, we're either betting or check defending. So we're only like check folding with about 25% of our hands on this flop. So even though at first it might seem like, wait, you're only betting half the time and defending half of your checks, but you're not defending nearly enough of checks against your opponent's half pot size bet, That's true. He can profitably bet any 2 cards. That doesn't mean we're not defending enough, but I mean, he can profitably bet any 2 cards. But he had to pay for that opportunity. You know, he had to put more money in pre-flop to maybe get the opportunity to bluff post-flop. And even when he does get the opportunity to bluff post-flop, it's only going to work about half the time. So we are defending either by betting or check calling or check raising about 3/4 of our range on the flop. So with that in mind, this doesn't seem that terrible, especially since a queen high board is actually the kind of board that I usually think hits the cold caller pretty well. I think queen high boards probably favor the cold caller more than the vast majority of flop textures, if not almost any other type of flop texture. And the reason for that is the button not only has a good amount of equity, his equity increased slightly as we saw earlier, but also these boards give the button some really strong hands in his range. Like he can have the ace queen, he can have the queen king. Those really make up like the bulk of the super strong hands on this board texture. So it's not like how it is in other spots where if the board came something like, I'm just going to make it up, like that, the button just doesn't have any strong hands. We have all the really awesome strong hands and a lot of really awesome bluffs. That's not the case here. So this is our first go through. This is what I have. If people have different stuff and they want to post it in the thread, by all means we can discuss it. But I think this seems pretty reasonable. And the other restriction that I just want to remind you of is another thing people might think is like, well, this 3-betting range is just clearly way too aggressive. If we're not able to defend more aggressively on the flop, you're going to have a hard time justifying like 11 or 12% 3-betting frequencies pre-flop against min raises or 2.5 opens, because if you do, it's going to let the button just open crazy wide. So while this is not, of course, a perfect range, just realize there's a lot of restrictions on what we can and can't do here. So a lot of the ways where it might seem easy to fix our problems, they're not really there. We can't just say, oh, you know what, let's just stop bluffing with this stuff and, you know, make our range stronger. You can't really do that, because otherwise you're then just not 3-betting aggressively enough pre-flop. Okay, so let's finish, or that finishes up that one. Let's go to the next one. Actually, I lied. Before we go to the next one, I want to just write down sort of like what I learned from having done this. And this sounds really lame, like something you'd have to do in grade school, but this is how you're going to store it in your memory much better. So my notes would be something like this. I need to check raise more aggressively on board textures where check calling is difficult. I already knew this from using single raise pots. I just have less experience in 3-bet pots, so my brain doesn't automatically do it like it does for single raise pots. So I write myself a note, so I know I need to fix that. So I need to, if I don't do this, I won't be defending nearly enough checks. Additionally, I need to not consider check folding a hand like ace king off here, since it has around 50% equity. Depending on, you know, that depends exactly on if it has the backdoor flush and stuff, but it has 54% equity on average, so that's just a lot. So it has around 54% equity, good showdown value, and it has good redraw, since it can draw out on the opponent's weaker pairs. If I turn an ace and he turns a queen with if I turn an ace and he has ace queen, such is life. So that was another leak I think I had. I probably would have known we can't check fold to ace king on this flop texture, but I don't think I would have realized the magnitude of how bad check folding ace king would be. It's one of those things where if I saw someone check fold ace king and they said, you know what, I'm going to check fold it here because it's a queen high board, so the button's going to have a lot of king queen and ace queen. I don't want to really check. I don't really want to bet it because I make dominated hands fold. I don't really want to check call it because I can still be dominated by his ace queen and queen king. I probably would have been like, okay, you know, that seems all right. Like, I mean, I wouldn't have been like super for it, but I wouldn't have really thought it was terrible. Now, after having played with this, I realize, nope, you're pretty much going to have to defend that, I think. Otherwise, you're going to be folding way too much, and it has a lot of equity. So it's a very interesting hand to realize, hey, ace queen has both a good amount of equity, so it can win at showdown, and it has that redraw. We're not folding it. I think check calling with it's going to be pretty effective. Okay, so now I'm ready to move on for seriously. And excuse me, I think I might have accidentally said ace queen. I, of course, meant ace king. Ace queen's an amazing hand here. Ace king is the one that has showdown value, if we check call it, and it has a good amount of redraw if our opponent has a pair. So, good hand to check call. Don't want to check fold it. So this was the next flop I randomly generated, and it had 48. The ranges were 48 and 52% equity again, so it caused no real change in equity based on the flop. But the first thing I do notice when we get this flop is when we're out of position, it's going to be probably easier to check a call here than it was on the last board. On the last board, we check called top sets and a few sort of middle pair or top pair, weak pair type hands, but we didn't have all that many. Here we have quite a lot. We have all the suited aces, pocket kings and pocket queens, and then even a hand like king jack makes 12 combos. So because of that, it's actually a little bit interesting to note we don't want to never bet some hands on the flop which can check call the turn, or which are planning to check call the turn. So what I mean by that is, if we, for example, on this board, if we were to bet all of our ace X's, all of our king jacks, and all of our kings and queens, then that would clearly be a problem because we wouldn't be check calling on the flop enough. But by the same token, if we never bet ace X suited, if we never bet kings, if we never bet queens, if we never bet king jack, then we might not be having many hands in our flop betting range that can check call on a lot of turn cards. So that's always very tricky when you're trying to figure out where exactly to place different types of hands, but that are very, very similar. But for the most part, I just want to mention here, yeah, I probably would mostly check call the king jacks and the ace X suited and the kings and queens, but we probably can bet a couple too. So let's just go ahead and jump in and start off with writing down the flop. So ace of diamonds, jack of clubs, four of clubs. We have less combos here since we made a lot more pairs. All right, so let's take the value bets. So let's start off with the obvious stuff. Ace king, that's going to be 12. Ace queen, that's going to be 12. Let's say we do ace 10 2, that's going to be 12. And ace jack is going to be 9. So let's start there. Again, we might find out we're wrong. Maybe we don't want to value bet ace 10, but ace 10 is probably a reasonable hand to bet. So that gets us 45 on our first go through. So just a lot more hands I can value bet. And then we have the draw betting range. So again, I'm going to cheat flush draw. So we have 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So we have 7 suited aces. So it's going to be 22 minus 8. So that's going to be 14. So we have 14 flush draws. Let's say we, bet 10 of them and then we check call and check raise too. Just want to write it down now so I don't forget. Okay. Maybe we can stretch this out a little bit. That's not the best idea. Okay, so we got that stuff. Let's keep sticking with just the obvious stuff. So I want to check call. Let me put a little space here. I want to check call with pocket aces. Aces could be another hand, actually, that you could bet the flop with and then check on the turn. So I don't want you to think you have to bet aces here, but I think I would check call with aces. So the cool thing about betting aces on the flop is if you get called, your opponent very likely has king 10, king queen, queen 10. So because of that, it makes sense to bet the flop with aces, then check call the turn because your opponent just doesn't have that many, ace X hands that you want to get value from. That said, I'd still probably check call the aces. The check raising range, I'm going to go ahead and assume we're going to be check raising the pocket jacks and the pocket fours. In general, just sets make very good hands to check raise on the flop if your range isn't way stronger than the opponent's, because you want to be able to protect your checking range, and then obviously check raising puts a lot more pressure on your opponent's bets and prevents him from being able to recklessly bet, since he hates it when he has a bluff catcher and he faces your check raise. Okay, so let's keep continuing with the bluffing range. Let's go king queen. That's going to be 15. Remember, gutshots make a lot of combos when you have the offsuit combos in your range. So that's going to be okay. So we don't have the king 10 suited. We don't have the queen 10 suited. Okay. So gutshot should only be these then, right? Yep, just those. Okay, so 15 gutters. Thought we had a little more at first. I'm going to write down like the XX. Let's just do the fours. Let's do the pairs of fours. Sorry, I'm mumbling a little bit as I try to figure this out. So ace 4 suited, king 4 suited. These can all be check raised too. They might get moved around. 5 4 suited. We also can do. Oh, ace 4 suited is 2 pair. You're going up here, buddy. All right. So it doesn't look like there's that many super slam dunk bluff hands here. So that's going to be something that I'm going to write to myself later when I take a note, which is there's just not that many bluffs. So we have to have we're going to have to lower our standard. So I'm still trying to find the easy ones. So let's just say we take the offsuit diamond stuff. So let's count those right now. So king 8 of diamonds, king 7, king 6, king 5, king 4. That's 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. So I'm going to assume we're going to be betting most, if not all, those the X of diamonds stuff. So that's 14 hand combos right there. Some of them maybe get check folded, but for the most part, I think that will be fine. Ace jack, ace queen. So since our range has so many strong hands here, it looks like we're mostly going to just be betting pretty aggressively, which is fine, I think. Although I know, let's look at the distribution actually. So top pair is 37, two pair is 10.5. Let's look at the button. Top pair, so less top pair and less two pair. So that's consistent with us betting aggressively. That doesn't mean that's the answer, but the fact that even though our range has only a little bit more equity, we have way more top pair and significantly more two pair or better too. That's consistent with us being the better. We have more hands in our range that want to get 3 streets or a value or get all in by the river. So that seems fine. Still looking for more air hands as I talk. Maybe it'll come to me as we add more stuff. So combos, we're going to check a call. Let's say we go kings and queens for... Actually, let's say we bet queens. So let's say we have kings, which is 6. Let's say we bet queens for... let's say we bet queens as well. So that gets his hand. I can bet the flop and check call the turn. Queens. What else? Let's say we check call king jack for 12. Again, it doesn't matter whether or not you really check call kings. Sorry, check call kings, or do you want to bet queens and then check call the turn? Just something that can check call on the turn is nice. Bluffing range. I guess we're going to end up bluffing the pocket pairs, the 5s and the 4s with a club. Seems fine. 5x with a club. 3. Sorry. And then the 3s as well. Yeah. And then rather than me just keep thinking about it, I'm just going to pause it and plug everything in. So I'm thinking about this right now and actually struggling a little bit. So what I think we're going to need to do is, if we look at the buttons flatting range, it has a lot more like Gutshot stuff. So I don't like the idea of giving tons of free cards. So by check calling, I give my opponent's Gutshots tons of free cards, and almost a third of his range is some sort of draw, whether it be a gutter, open-ended straight draw, or flush draw. Actually, sorry, he can't have open-ended straight draws. So whether it be a flush draw or a Gutshot. So I think what I want to do is start value betting these ace, 10, and queens, and then you either go bet, check, or bet, check. So don't bet all 3 streets. You just want to bet 1 or 2 streets with these hands, because that's more effective against the Gutshots. The other problem with this range is, which I've almost never even seen before, is it's actually really hard to find remotely reasonable bluffs, which is not something you almost ever encounter for single raise pots. It's usually pretty easy to see what to float with, what to bluff with. It's usually not a problem. But here, if we count these value hands, we have, I'm double counting it right now, if we have 12, 24, 33, 36, 48, 54. So we have 54 value hands. If we only have these 41 bluffs, that's not enough. So then what we can do is we can start widening this range. But if you look at this range right here, what other hands are you going to add? All of these hands up here are just really connected. You could put something like 10s as a bluff, kind of, but that doesn't even really work that well there. So it's really hard to figure out what hands to bluff with, because we just don't have good bluffs, but we have a lot of hands that want to value bet. So on one hand, we might just have to really just say something like, crap air or something like that. Or we can make the 5s all 6 combos and then the 3s all 6 combos. But for the most part, it's going to be really hard to figure out how to get this bluffing ratio high enough. And again, it's not going to be exactly 1.5 to 1, because you want around the 1.5 bluff to 1 value betting range ratio if the value bets are really strong. Here we're value betting some weaker stuff, but it still looks really tough. I'm not sure exactly what to do, but I think it's going to be something like this. And then, again, I would encourage you to pause right now and just really look at this range. And most people will probably agree this looks like a pretty reasonable range. You are having trouble finding hands to just really completely bluff with here. There's just not a lot of good bluffs. All right, so this is what I came up with, which I'm kind of liking. So notice we're value betting even more than we're bluffing, which is not usual, but I already talked about that a little bit. Here's the check calling range: aces, kings, king jack, flush draws, and ace x suited. This does have the problem of not having any sort of like air hands that can become bluffs later, But in this situation, since we don't really have any overcards, any gut shots, or anything that can kind of check call well and be bluffed later, I think this is the best I can come up with, which seems reasonable. It's not that hard to model a game where one person has the polarized range and one person has a condensed range, so, a range of only bluff catchers. That's pretty much what we have here. So this is the exception. We have some nutted hands for protection, and then we have these hands here, which are the bluff catching range. And then, so once we check to our opponent, he knows we have the nuts 10% of the time, and then the other 90% of the time we have a bluff catcher. One thing to note, too, is technically the aces, if our opponent knew our exact range, he would know that the removal effect would be too significant when he has an ace. So we probably wouldn't check a call with exactly three combinations of ace-ace here, because if we did, our opponent would know when he has a hand like ace-10, our opponent really can't be beat, because he blocks 2/3 of our combos here. But something like that's kind of so detailed. I mean, you can take note of it, which is why I'm mentioning it. But for the most part, I would just check call with aces and let the opponent bluff. Although if you wanted to, you could bet with aces and then check call something else that allows the opponent to double barrel a little bit. Or that doesn't let the opponent double barrel knowing he can't be beat. So, for example, if we check called with pocket fours on the flop, then our opponent wouldn't be able to barrel as aggressively with an ace-x hand because we have the nuts more often. Okay. And then we have the check-raising range of pocket jacks and pocket fours. That seems fine. So there's just 6 combos right here. And then jack-9 suited and 10s. So notice the reason why I'm check-raising pocket 10s and jack-9 is if the opponent checks back, we can just win. So I'm choosing to check-raise with these hands rather than check-call them because I don't really like the idea. I mean, first of all, we need some check-raise bluffs. And I don't really like the idea of check-raise bluffing with just a garbage hand. So there's no way to solve this. I could be wrong. But on a board like this, when the opponent has so many hands with so much equity, I'm really trying to avoid bluffing or check calling with hands that are completely awful. And even without doing this, we're betting almost 60% of the time and we're defending almost 2/3 of our checks. So we're still playing very aggressively, despite the fact that each range has almost 50% equity and our opponent has the advantage of position. But our range is probably better than his. We have more premium hands, whereas he has a lot more like Gutshot types hands. So overall, this is the range that I think I like this range. And then the last thing I was going to check is I wanted to see how often the opponent has and ace-10 or better. And this should only be 2 combos, as I'm sure some people noticed. Okay, cool. So that will change the frequencies hardly nothing at all. So here, let's look. So the buttons range. So let's see. How many hands does he have that are better than ace-10? So let's just count. He has pocket aces, and then ace-queens, which is another 12, so that's 15. Ace-jack, which is another 12, so that's 27. So it would be 27 divided by 182. Let me do that real quick. Sorry about that. Let me recount it once more. So aces is 3. Ace-queen is 12, which gives us 15. Ace-jack is 9, which gives us 24. And then ace-4 suited is 3, which gives us 27. So 27 divided by 182. That means our opponent has us beat 15% of the time on the flop when we have ace-10. And then if we add in the fact that we could be splitting when we give our opponent another 12 combos of ace-10, so that will be 27 plus 12 for 39 divided by 182. That means we're either tied or beat on the flop a little over 1/5 of the time. So now the next thing I would calculate is if our opponent calls 2/3 of our flop bet, 2/3 of our turn bets, and 2/3 of our river bet, that'll be 0.6667 times 0.6667 times, whoa, I need to add the decimal, 0.6667 times 0.6667 times 0.6667. So if we're so on the river, if we bet and we get called, we're going to lose about 2/3 of the time if we bet ace-10. So you could run another calculation to see if you still want to do that, because when you're out of position, you don't need to win over half the time when called. So that's a really, really important thing to remember, because it's super relevant for 3-bet pots. You do not need to win over half the time to be called when you're betting out of position. And here we're also splitting, so that seems like a whole separate calculation. So yeah, it's going to really depend on the turn of the river run out. I mean, there's no point in spending too much more time on this, but when we start off with value betting ace-10, my guess is we're not usually going to bet turn and river, because if the turn's or river is any sort of club or any sort of hand that adds, even if it was something like obviously a 10 or a not, or a 10 especially, a 10 queen or king would add a lot more combinations of straights and 2 pairs into our opponent's range. So I think in most cases, we're probably not going to bet all 3 streets with ace-10. We'll probably go bet, check call, or bet, check fold, or something like that. So that's something that's useful to do when you're trying to figure out ranges, is figure out how often the hands beat and then how often the opponent's going to have to call down on like a blank turn in river. So even if the turn in the river blank in this case, we're still going to mostly lose if we're called after going bet with ace-10. And honestly, the turn in the river is not going to usually come a complete blank here. So I think this range looks pretty good. These hands are not going to be betting all 3 streets. These are going to be the bluffs. And then this is the check calling and check raising range. Notice I still like having a reasonable check raising range here, because even though we're, check raising at a pretty high frequency, 14 out of 79 checks is what? That's about a little less than 20%, which is very high actually. So we're check raising here still 17% of the time, but since our opponent has so many gut shots in his range, 29%, it makes sense to want to check raise rather than check call, because gut shots have a 20% chance of turning or rivering the nuts pretty much. All right. So for the notes here, I would just say something like notes. It is very hard to find good bluffs as the 3-better in this spot. There aren't many, gut shots, overcards, or 3 to the flush draw plus 3 to the straight draw type hands, which make bluffing and check raise bluffing difficult. I'll say c-bet bluffing. Okay, cool. So we only have like 10 minutes left, but still, let's go for it. Let's randomly generate one more. Okay, so this one's very similar to the last one, which is a big advantage about doing these type of things. This one will be probably the easiest one we've seen. I'm not even going to do it, because we have so many ace-x and king-x hands that can check call. So here we can easily bet an ace-x hand, which will have our opponent call with his gut shots, like queen-jack, queen-10, jack-10. Then we can check call the ace-x on the turn. That also gets its value from our opponent's king-x's. Likewise, if we have king-x, we can just go ahead and sort of check call it on the flop. We're still going to want to check raise here sometime. We're not going to want to give our opponent a bunch of free cards once we check and he bets with his gut shots and stuff like that. But for the most part, I would think this would be a really easy board to do, to the point where I don't even want to do it. The big advantage of doing this Flopzilla stuff is you're able to kind of tell what to do reasonably well after you've seen a similar board. So let's just keep going. Okay, we're not doing this one in 10 minutes, but we're going to try. So the first thing that stands out to me on this board, and this almost always goes hand in hand, is this board's very hard to check call on, which means being in position is very valuable. So without me spoilering you, it's probably, whoa, I was not expecting that. Okay, so let's just do that one more time in case people weren't watching as I was chatting. So pre-flop, the 3-better range has 52% equity. Post-flop, 44% equity. It loses 8% equity. That's huge. Way more than even I was expecting there. Oh, this is insane. Okay, so then let's look at the top pair. Let's keep looking at the range for a second. Okay, so sorry, I'm excited. I'm talking fast. I always try to talk slow, but I always fail. Okay, so the button 3-bet flat has 2-pair better 6.5%. The small blind 3-bet has it 4.8. The small blind 3-bet has a little bit more over pairs, and top pairs 27, whereas the button has 31% top pair and a little bit less over pairs. Okay, so even when it comes, so I would say a few things here. The button's range has more equity. At a glance, it looks like it has a better distribution of equity. It has more 2 pairs or better, and it has more top pairs or better. And I was going somewhere else with this. Oh, yeah, and it has the advantage of being in position. So that alone tells me, once I've just played with this board like this, in reality, if I were to just play and I wasn't thinking, well, I'm sure I would end up check folding this board a ton and betting it a ton. That usually doesn't make a lot of sense, because it's like, well, if I'm check folding this board a ton, then I'm having a really hard time defending my checks, which should encourage me to check raise with my strong hands to prevent my opponent from being able to recklessly bet. And also, even on this board texture, like let's look at our 3-betting range. We have a lot of hands that our opponent's probably just not going to want to give a bunch of free cards to. So, for example, if we're checking this board with, like, let's say we plan on check calling ace-king here. If our opponent has queen-jack, he's not going to want to give us a bunch of free cards. If our opponent has king-10, he's not going to want to give us a bunch of free cards. So even if we're check raising this board aggressively, since it's so risky to give free cards on this board texture, our opponent's not going to want to recklessly bet. It's not something that let me repeat what I just said. So I misspoke, so let me say that one more time. Even though our opponent knows we're often going to check raise him on this flop, he's still going to be strongly encouraged to bet pretty aggressively because his range is stronger than ours and because he doesn't like giving us free cards. And a lot of the hands that we're going to check call with specifically, I'm guessing, such as ace-king, he's really not going to want to give free cards. So because of that, what ends up happening is this is a board where we should be checking at a very high frequency, check raising reasonably often, and our opponent should be betting at a very high frequency. So to make all that make sense, the EV of us check raising our stronger hands needs to be higher than the EV of us betting them. So this is a board texture where I don't know exactly what our betting frequency on a flop is going to be, but it's probably not going to be very high. So for a crazy board like this, when I haven't done this spot before, I would start with saying, let's see what the range looks like if we check our entire range. I mean, let's give it a go. So right here, let's say on the flop, we bet nothing. So let's say we're check raising. What hands can we check raise? We can check raise. Let's see the premium stuff. 2 pair or better. So we only have 10 of those. Okay, so let's say we check raise jacks, 10s, 9-8 suited. The removal effect of jacks here does kind of matter, but since our opponent has so much combo stuff going on, I'd still probably check raise it rather than check call. And we have 4 of these. So that gets us up to 10. The other thing we can do, since I don't think that will be check raising aggressively enough, is we can start check raising some over pairs, and we just have to be aware that we're going to be lost a lot on the turn. And we're probably going to want to make our check raise pretty big. So what I mean by that is it's totally fine to check raise aces, and then when the turn card comes at king, go, ooh, that's tough. Because on the flop, we're only beat 6.6% of the time when we have aces, kings, or queens. Oh, sorry, no, 10% of the time because our opponent has aces. So since we're only beat 10% of the time here, I mean, that's still beat more than we would like, but between, check raising and occasionally running into a better hand when we have pocket kings or giving a bunch of free cards, I would rather check raise. So let's say we check raise pocket kings, pocket kings, pocket queens, and pocket aces. So that gets us in our 18. That gets us to 28 combos. So where I'm going with this, which hopefully should make sense, is since it's a 3-bet pot, the pot's already pretty big. So if we have a capped range, it's not really going to be that bad on the turn. Now, of course, I don't like the fact that we check raised all of our strong hands on the flop if the turn card comes at 2. But the turn card is not going to blank all that often. An ace, a king, a queen, a jack, a 10, a 9, an 8, and a 7 all probably aren't blanks. So the turn's not going to come a 6 or lower all that often. And when it does, we're just going to have to deal with it. But our opponent can't really punish us by overbetting because there's not that much stack depth. So it's not like in a single raise pot where our opponent can make like a massive overbet on the turn of the river relative to the size of the pot. There isn't that much stack depth. So because of that, it makes me just care less if I have a capped range. So that I think is going to be like the check raising range. And then if we check raised another, maybe we can check call a few of these or find some super small betting range, but let's just start off doing that. And then if we check call, this is the value check raising range. So add in the 28 bluffs. I'll put a little note there. 28 bluffs. And then the check calling range, I would say, just start with the obvious stuff. So let's go ace, jack. Actually, I'm just going to list it like this for the sake of speed. So we have top pair is 13.1. Oh, sorry, no, I said the percentage. Top pair is 27 combos. Let's see if we call with all of our middle pair. Middle pair is 15 combos. Yeah, that's fine. Get on board, ace 10. And then let's see what else we got. We have king, queens, and stuff. So let's say we check call king, queen. That's 16. That's a lot. Ace, king. Let's say that's 16. Ace, queen. That's 16. All right. Let's see if we check. Oh, we don't have 9s or 8s. I'm going to go ahead and check raise like the 7-8 suited and stuff. So I'm just going to add that in right now. So I know we got to add a lot more bluffs. But let's say we check raise 8-7 suited. Let's say we check raise 9-7 suited. We can also check raise I'm looking for just more naked 9s and stuff. 10-8 suited. Oh, wait, we check called that. That's fine to check call. So let's just say, even though it's not a gut shot, we can do like 7-6 suited, 7-5 suited. I'm still looking for sort of. It sucks that we didn't 3-bet the ace-9 or the ace-8 suited, because now I don't have these 4 combinations of gut shots, which I wish I did, that I could check raise. Let's see what else we got here. Oh, we have tons of gutters. Oh, that's counting all the ace, king, ace, queen. 8-7. Okay, king 8 suited. King 8 suited, cool. King 7 suited can be check raised as well. I don't care if that's check called or check raised. Let's move this down. So let's see how many we have. We have 3, 6, 9, 18, and we wanted 28. So we have like 10 more to go. Ugh. 10 more to go. All right, let's just. So I need bluffs 10. Okay. So let's keep going with the check calling stuff and see if anything else seems obvious. Notice this alone is already a balanced range. Like, that seems weird, but it's like we have the top pair, we have the middle pair, we have a bunch of draws, and we have some hands that both can improve and can win at showdown. That's kind of nifty that it already is sort of this little mini balanced range. And again, it'd be nice if we had some nutted hands, but we are going to make the nuts with some hands on the turn. Although we did check raise most of the 9s and 8s, so these cards hitting will be worse. I mean, we could have like Jack 9, 10-8 suited and stuff like that. But, oh, we have Queen 9 suited too. I lied. Queen 9 suited. But yeah, the 9 and the 8s are not going to be good turns after check calling. We will hit sometimes, but just not as much as we'd like. Okay, so let's start counting this stuff up here. So we have 31, 27. So it's 58. 58 plus 16, that's 74, 90, 93. I'm going to double check that right now. So 27, 15 is 42, 58, 74, 90, 93. Cool. And then if we checked all this stuff, and you know what? Bluffs 10 is actually probably too much because this board's so wet and our value check raises aren't that strong. So honestly, we might not even need any of these 10 bluffs, much less all 10. So let's get this down a little bit more. I still want to find like 3 more. I just, I believe in myself. So what else is it? I guess we can. Oh wait, 8-6 suited. Thank you. So 8-6 suited 4. Okay, so let's count these now. So 3, 6, 10, 28, 31, 34, 37, 40, 50. I'm going to count once more. 10, 18, 28, 31, 34, 37, 40, 50. Okay. So that means we're total checks defended 143 out of 206 combos. Then I'm going to go on a little side detail. So I actually am liking this range way more than I thought I was going to like it at the beginning. So check defending frequency is 69.4%. So on a board like this, our opponent's has more. Oh, I didn't mean to leave that there. Our opponent's range has more equity than ours, and our opponent has a better distribution of equity than ours, and our opponent's in position, and position's huge. Betting when you're out of position, most people look at it like this. I want to bet really, really wide, but I need to make sure I'm defending enough checks. And that's usually an easier way to describe it and what people are comfortable with. But I actually think it's best if you look at betting as like a luxury. Betting's like, I'm going to bet because if I don't bet, my checking range is going to be so strong that my opponent's just not going to bet very often, and then I'm better off having bet my strong hands myself. Let me say that one more time. If I check with such a strong range against you, you're not really going to bet very much because you don't want to be check raising and check calling against you so aggressively. So you exploit me by checking back. I can only do that if my checking range is strong to begin with. Here, I think even if we check all of our really good hands, our checking range just isn't that strong. So in theory, do I imagine there's a betting range here? Yes. I imagine in theory you'd bet some very, very small range, but people are always used to like c-betting like 40, 50, 60, sometimes even 70% of their range. And in reality here, our c-betting frequency should maybe be like 10%, something like that, maybe 15%. A very, very low frequency because once we bet at a higher frequency, our checks become too vulnerable, then our opponent's going to bet a bunch, and then we would have been better off checking with our strong hands. So rather than worry about that super, super small range here, which might not even exist, I would kind of just be like, oh, my notes here, notes. Jack 10-7 board has so much coordination and that it sucks even more than my first guess. More than I first imagined. Our opponent goes from, it was like 48% equity pre-flop to 56% equity post-flop. I think we're better off checking close to our entire range than betting here. Note to self, or I'm already writing a note to myself. Key point, check raise this flop non-stop. So that would be what I really took from doing this. If the board changes a little bit, like let's say the board goes like, becomes this. Yeah, this board's going to be different. And I'm not sure exactly what to do here. This would be a very hard board that I need to analyze. But I've at least seen this board, which, again, admittedly is different. And it's shown me, like, hey, I really got to be careful with check raising these boards. Our opponent's not going to want to give us a lot of free cards. And this board gives our opponent, a lot of equity. And now, since I'm just curious, even though I know I'm already probably running over, let's do a board like that and see not do the board, but I just want to see how the equity changes. So from 56% to 52%. So that, this board gives our opponent significantly more equity than the other one, but both are bad for our range. And it's important on these boards. Yeah, we still should have a betting range, but we're going to need to check raise aggressively. Okay, so I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I'm going to do some more of these. Hopefully I'll get better as we go along. Just as everything else works in life, I'm sure I will. And if you have any questions or comments, feel free to post them. There should be a lot of interesting discussion if people want to start posting boards and talking about it, which I'm more than willing to do. So thanks guys for watching. Good luck. I'll see you later.